Good evening. My name is Catherine Newmark, and I am hoping that we will be joined shortly by Glenn Loury. But I can already welcome you, the audience, to our 22nd International Literature Festival Berlin. I'm so glad you could join us here and online through the live stream. I am delighted to be hosting this event, the panel on race and identity tonight. It's a difficult topic, to be sure, and a hot-button issue. But I hope with the help of my three distinguished panelists, one of whom we have yet to see on the screen, we will make some headway. We have about 60 minutes here on the panel, and then we can open also to questions from the audience. And at any event, we have to be out of here at 7:15 at the latest. Now, I'm not quite sure if I should wait for Glenn Loury to appear. I would hope that he should be with us in a second. I'm looking at the technician. There he is. Good evening.
Glenn.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Loury. I'm Catherine Newmark. I'm going to be hosting the panel. I just said that we have about an hour of panel discussion, and then we can open to some audience questions. And to make the most of this very limited time, I'm going to very briefly introduce our three panelists. First, there is Joyce Nyairo, a Kenyan independent researcher, cultural critic, author, and columnist with a focus on, among other things, cultural memory. She is currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftler zu Berlin. Her latest book was called Kenya at 50, Trends, Identities, and the Politics of Belonging, and it was published in Nairobi in 2015. Welcome, Joyce Nyairo.
Thank you.
Then I have Thomas Chatterton Williams, an award-winning American writer and cultural essayist. He writes and has written for prestigious publications such as The Atlantic and the New York Times Magazine, among many others. He lives in France, well, mostly, which is not irrelevant to his understanding of race and identity, as those who have read his last book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, published in 2019, might know. Welcome, Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Thank you.
And finally, joining us remotely, we are very honored to have Glenn Loury, an American economist, professor of social science and economics at Brown University, an influential public intellectual, particularly on questions of race and social disparity, subjects he discusses often in his podcast, The Glenn Show, and his seminal book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, that was first published in 2002, was republished recently in 2021. Welcome, Glenn Loury. I'm glad you could join us.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you.
Now, the subject we're supposed to discuss here is race and identity. And given the composition of our panel, the fact that we have an American perspective, a half American, half European perspective, and an African perspective, what I think we should do and is use this opportunity to think about the question of race and racism, or racial stigma, as Glenn Loury might say, on a somewhat global scale, and to ask how these different perspectives can help us here to understand what we are talking about. There is, of course, a sociological argument to be made for these things to be highly localized and historically specific, but there is also a historical argument to be made for there being a near global, at the very least transatlantic history of exploitation, colonization, slavery, that has led to racism, to people of African descent being universally stigmatized, and conversely to people of vaguely Caucasian ethnicity, or so-called white people, to be universally privileged. That would be the counterposition. So maybe let us start here. If you could possibly sort of share your views and thoughts on the question of how and if at all racism can function as a universal category. That would be sort of my first question. Maybe, Thomas, you would like to start with that question?
Can racism function as a universal category?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
a global category. Let's not say the universe. Let's just take it down here.
Well, I think thanks for starting easy. I think that's, I mean, there certainly is the collision of Europe and Africa that happened during the transatlantic slave trade and culminated in America with, the institution of slavery that has repercussions we're still dealing with right now. That's undeniable, and there's a history of exploitation of people sold from Africa into the New World, and there's a history of colonialism that still plays out very painfully in places like especially like France right now. But also we live in a time that I think is a lot more complicated than many of our mainstream conversations allow for. There's a lot of categorical thinking that doesn't take into account the nature of what it means to be white or black in the 21st century, especially in America, where class becomes racialized in such a way that the racial category can often obscure more than it can elucidate, especially when you talk about people who are not necessarily poor. Or maybe the way to put it is that, when blackness and poverty overlap, it creates something very specific. But I guess the way that the conversation has been heavily playing out since 2020, since the racial reckoning after the killing of George Floyd, I guess what I resist is the kind of conflation of all black experience with the experience of someone like George Floyd, because I don't think that actually allows us to grapple with all of the ways in which he was very disadvantaged because of his class position, and there are many people who share his ethnic and racial ancestry or are descended from slavery, but who have, for so many different reasons, transcended the kind of social position he was locked in. So I think in order to talk about these legacies, we also have to be open to the possibility that things do change, and that the past does not determine the present or the future. And the way that the anti-racist conversation goes in America so much is that past discrimination necessitates present discrimination and ensures future discrimination, and that we're kind of trapped in these categories that are all important and can never be transcended.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to pass a sort of the same type of question to Joyce, because I think the African perspective here is, of course, extremely important to our European and American understanding of racism, the actual ex-colonies, what the sort of the racism means as a category, and how do you look from the outside at the debates such as they are being held in America specifically, but also in Europe?
That's a really difficult question, but thank you. What's at the back of my mind is what Thomas just said about the fact that you cannot conflate black experience. And I'm going to come back to that because, in a sense, I think you can, and I'm going to give the justification for how and when that happens. But let's, get to your question, which was specifically around the post-colonials and how they see their place in the world. It's difficult to come to terms with the idea that in many ways your identity was defined by an experience that took place in your country 100 and something years ago. And the reason I say that is, take Kenya or Nigeria or any of the so-called Anglophone countries. The fact that we speak English as the unifying language in the country is itself an indication of the fact that there is a determination to our identities that we can't transcend now. Or maybe we can, because if you listen to the way we speak, there is a fundamental way in which we have localized that language. And we're now very categorical that you cannot speak of English, you must speak of Englishes. So how we see ourselves is also contributing to the whole, as opposed to being an appendage, which is how we had been defined. And we now see a validity in our perspectives, in our experiences, and in what they bring to the center. And always arguing that who we are and how we play out makes it difficult, really, for any other category to remain static. It must take cognizance of how we are playing out that identity. Now, if I could just loop on the issue that I flagged, that Thomas said, is there a way in which, for instance, and the really difficult thing here is when we talk about race, there's a sense in which blackness cannot be defined outside of whiteness and vice versa. That has been kind of the epistemological approach to race, that you use one category to define the other and brown somewhere in there, When we talk about you cannot conflate black experience, one of the most interesting things I find about identity is how it is performed in and by the body. And I think, Thomas, you talk about this in your book, Losing the Cool, just how hip hop allows you to have this whole performative thing. But across, like on the African continent, and when the worlds meet, when Africa meets Europe, when Africa meets America, what you then find is how blackness plays out indeed in the body. And specifically what always catches my attention is what has been described, I think it was Mukoma Ngugi who wrote a piece on this, the black nod. You see a black person across the street, you nod. And that nod says so many things. It says, I see you, I recognize you, I know your struggle, you matter. So there's a whole history that goes into that nod. And you don't have to say anything. It's completely non-verbal communication, but it is so loaded. What's interesting about the black nod, I will do it if I'm walking in New York. I found myself doing it as I walk in Berlin. I never do it in Nairobi. I never do it in Lagos. I don't need to. Why?
Well.
Can I stop there?
Yeah, that is probably the heart of the question. I will need to follow up on that one, but I would like to bring Glenn Loury in. I think most of your work that I know, and it's so vast that there is no chance of knowing all of your work, it does make the point that we have to not talk about universal categories, but rather about specific social situations. And so I would like to sort of hear from you what you think, if we talk about a transatlantic sort of global perspective on race and racism, how can this sort of help us to understand specificity and also generalization of the race and identity debates?
Oh, well, I hate to be a naysayer, but I'm against the project of globalizing the racial conversation. I think that's also 20th and 19th century. I think the 21st century is moving in a different direction. I think the world grows small. The creative director for my podcast is a Russian whom I've never actually been in the same room with. He lives in Yerevan, Armenia, and we are doing a lot of business together, he and I. I don't speak Russian, but his English is impeccable. The world is a small place. And, we have this race conversation and it's whites and blacks. But really, there are a lot more Chinese than there are, Americans. There are a lot more South Asians, Indians, and Pakistanis than there are Europeans. And what the 21st century is going to bring us, I think, is a very, very different template. I like to, when talking about the United States, ask people to take themselves back to the turn of the 20th century, to 1910. Immigrants teeming into the country from every quarter, from Russia, from Italy, having been coming for some decades from Ireland, from the Slavic lands. And they were races on their own understanding at that time. Fast forward a century to 2010, and the memory of that racial distinction amongst these various immigrant populations to the United States is a faint one. They will perhaps refer to themselves as Irish or Italian because they have some such ancestry, but it won't be a thick identity for themselves. My anticipation, my forecast is that we're going to find blackness in the United States having a similar trajectory over the course of the 21st century. And that's a good thing, too. Why be trapped in the legacy and the residue of that colonial past? Why let it define us? Let's open ourselves up and move forward. Intermarriage in the United States between races is going gangbusters. The number of multiracial or interracial people in our population grows dramatically. It's not a static situation. We should be looking forward, not backward.
Now, not to look back at the colonial past, but to a certain degree, I think we do have to look at the current, even though somewhat waning American hegemony, which both is political but also cultural, and which of course has large influence also on the debates on race and racism in Europe and in other parts of the world. This is something that you have written about as well, this sort of the George Floyd moment, as you said, it was a racial reckoning also in Europe. It inspired something, it sparked something that was important. It sparked important debates also in Germany, and that was a very fruitful thing. At the same time, it is also always in the danger of sort of modeling the understanding of race and racism on a specific American situation, which is not exactly the same in Germany. Germany has, Lord knows we have problems with racism, but they are not all to do with the racism between so-called black and so-called white people. And that is sort of a problem that I think Europe has to grapple with to some extent, that the import of theories and political themes to a degree can stimulate, but also can sort of make things a bit harder to understand. So I would very much like to get really the African perspective on this, because you have this sort of, Joyce, I think you have this privilege of knowing both debates, the European and the American one, and looking at them from sort of a third perspective. How do you think this sort of and also how, to what degree do, for example, American debates on race and racism influence African thought? How are they discussed and received in Kenya, for example? That is something that I would really be interested to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can use a specific example, the George Floyd issue, and the way that resonated in a country like Kenya. So if you looked at what's popularly known as KOT, Kenyans on Twitter, they're an institution. Try not to get into a fight with them. If you looked at the response of KOT, what they were really saying is, we know this exploitation. Because I think what really creates a strong category of blackness is a history of exploitation. Whether that history is recent, as in last month, or it's 100 years ago. And so the George Floyd issue resonated with KOT, it resonated with Kenyans because, you still have people in that country with a lived memory of similar type of brutality. It's not that long ago. It's 60, 70 years ago. So, 70 years ago. So you're saying that in a situation like that, and narratives get passed on, there's something that resonates. But the other thing that we have to consider that kind of creates a platform for the constant interaction and exchange is, if you look at, for example, trends like music, and you look at the way the emergence of hip hop resonated as a self-defining moment for, I would in this case specifically say Kenyans, and you look at the kind of music that they created, inspired by hip hop and kind of local varieties that emerged, then you begin to see, and it's an interesting question. We could ask the question about whether it's simply a question of Africa borrowing from African Americans, or whether there's a trade that happens the other way. And I think if you look at music, you'll find that the currents flow both ways. You have Nigerian artists who are collaborating with American artists. And so I think it flows both ways now more than ever before. And that for me is an important thing, to the extent that you're not talking about one category being forever recipients. But I think one of the other big questions that we mustn't lose here is the idea that there's nothing that is fixed. And I'd really like us to exhaust that argument around identities that are constantly in formation. And for us, what it means in Africa, specifically those countries that were colonized by the British, you had a situation in which colonial anthropology spent a lot of time categorizing people and limiting them into very narrow units called tribes. I was just telling a colleague of mine the other day that I never use the word tribe because it carries so much negative baggage. And because, it's a prison that limits who you can be. Because colonial anthropologists were very strict about this particular group, they're very loyal and they're great dancers. This other group, they're completely unreliable and completely refused to see decades of interaction that had happened between communities even before colonialism. Now, the reason why we are saying it's not static is now more than ever before, the kind of mixing and blending that there is between these communities, and I prefer to call them communities rather than tribes, makes complete nonsense of the categories that had been created before. And the real tragedy for us as a post-colonial country is that the government lags behind in understanding the plurality of identities and how useless it is to issue somebody with an identity card that locks them down to a particular place. So that even when you ask the question, where are you from? And I really love the way Kwame Anthony Appiah puts this. The question, where are you from, in a country like mine, is actually supposed to limit you. It's supposed to leave you out. And what Kwame Anthony Appiah says, which I totally agree with, is that the correct answer to where are you from must always be a story. Because it's about where you've borrowed, who you've met, where you've moved from. I like to say that the correct answer to the question, where are you from, is it depends. Because identity should be something I can, depending on what I need.
Yes, I think we can get back to that. There's a very interesting chapter on identities and tribal politics in Kenya in your book as well. But I want to also sort of pose this question to Thomas, because your French perspective, I think, takes you somewhat outside of the American debates on some levels. And how do you, for example, from a European stance, perceive these debates or the racial reckoning? How did that resonate in France? And sort of in what way was the import of this anti-racism, this powerful sort of feeling, fruitful, and to what extent did it feel like there was also sort of a dissonance there?
Yeah, that's something I'm thinking about, excuse me, quite a lot right now. I'm finishing a piece for The Atlantic trying to compare what was happening in France with what was happening in America, and as part of my next book, which is trying to make sense of this paradigm shift of 2020, I was really struck watching the events unfold in America, being in France, and seeing things like at Oxford University, you could get out of your final exams by saying that you were too traumatized by having seen what happened to George Floyd. What happened to George Floyd was terrible, but it makes no sense why at Oxford University in England, you could get out of your exams for having witnessed that when there's a Uyghur genocide happening, there's what's happened in Syria, there's all types of atrocities every day. Jamal Khashoggi was, cut up and put in a suitcase in the Saudi embassy, but you couldn't get out of your exams for anything else. But for the death of George Floyd, this American event meant you could get out of your exams for being traumatized at Oxford University. In Finland, you had marches against white supremacy. Finland has less than 2% of non-Finnish peoples living there. It's a completely Finnish society.
So it's actually white supremacy.
Is it? Is it? Does that make sense?
No, I mean, it's actually, yeah.
I mean, are Finns even really white? I mean, they were colonized by Swedes and Russians for most of their history. I mean, what does this social justice kind of rhetoric that comes through social media, what does it mean in the local context? In France, it was interesting because you quickly got several months later into a situation where a high school teacher was beheaded in a suburb of Paris for teaching in his class, the civics lesson that a free society needs to have free speech. And a Twitter mob spread this, and a Chechen immigrant refugee came and hunted him down and beheaded him in the street. And the Washington Post and other American outlets reported that as a kind of person of color reacting to white supremacy. And all the way up to the president of France, there was a reaction that said, wait a minute, this paradigm doesn't fit us. What are you talking about? This person is a Chechen Muslim, but he's not a person of color, and the teacher that was beheaded is not an instrument of whiteness. In France, we don't even keep these statistics. You know, you can say France has a history of colonialism, has lots of problems, but the French don't see themselves as participating in this American discourse that has the racial binary between people of color and white people, and many of the French were reacting, saying that this is being imposed on us, and in fact, this kind of American social justice rhetoric functions to them as a kind of ongoing American cultural imperialism, which they feel actually, you know, that kind of scrambles the categories of who's right and wrong, who has power, who doesn't have power, who's subjecting someone else to a sort of oppression. So that was interesting to see. And, you know, at the same time, and what I'm trying to bring out in the piece I'm working out for The Atlantic is that it's not all wrong. Some of these lessons, actually, the French could stand to learn, that there is a kind of difficulty in an evolving society with clinging to a kind of rigid universalism that refuses to respect shifting complexities of the social body that encompass different perspectives. So basically, a French person can say, you as a Muslim, black, skinned woman descended from people from Senegal, you have no experience that I can't access. It's too rigid that way, and there's a kind of racial reckoning that was happening in America that I think could benefit some Europeans from being exposed to. But it always comes down to this question of when does a correction become an overcorrection, and when does a kind of good idea actually start to facilitate something that counteracts the thing it's trying to achieve. And so I think what the French are very wary about is getting into the kind of situation you have in America where identity becomes all, and where you can't ever escape it, and they don't want to lose this tradition that I think you also have to an extent in Germany, that says, like, the state doesn't want to collect statistics and categorize people based on abstract categories that are supposed to mean who has access to opportunity, who has privilege, who doesn't have privilege. That's something they don't want to participate in. And so it's certainly an interesting conversation, but I think that it becomes interesting when you put the United States approach in conversation with the European approach, and I think the African approach is going to have to be brought in as well. And you know, I think that oftentimes we participate in a kind of American provincialism, which just doesn't really take much of the rest of the world into account ever.
Glenn Loury, I want to hand over to you, who does not participate in any American provincialism, I am sure. But I do wonder, the questions that Thomas just raised about sort of when does a counter-reaction become sort of counterproductive. I mean, you have been for a very long time, not from the very beginning of your work, but for a very long time, a very vocal and eloquent sort of speaker and critic of racism or racial stigma, racial disparities in American society. And lately you have become more associated with what some people call the heterodox thinkers. Now, heterodox to what, actually? What is the orthodoxy in the heterodox that we're speaking about here? In which way do you think sort of society at large, or at least cultural elites, have passed you on the left on a motorway that you do not want to have there in a way?
Well, I said at the start of this that I'm a naysayer, and I'm against the simplistic effort to take racial difference and make some big, dramatic, all-encompassing, sweeping narrative out of it. I don't think, frankly, that the event that happened in Minneapolis in 2020, when Derek Chauvin, a so-called white police officer, put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, a black man, I don't see it necessarily as a racial event. A cop encounters a arrest-resistant citizen and abuses his authority and power, the cop does, to the extent of extirpating the man's life. That's a horrible, horrible thing. It happens to white people in this country too. Racial reckoning out of what is really not a lynch mob, not a Ku Klux Klansman, not an organized militia, not a political vendetta, but a, I'm sorry to have to say, more or less mundane event in the maintenance of order in a metropolitan area. It's happening hundreds or thousands of times in the United States, and it happens more often to whites than blacks. We decided to make it a racial event. The press decided, political actors decided to make it a racial event. Demagogues decided to make a big deal out of something that, in my view, objectively, needn't have been read as a racial event. A racial reckoning, where are we now? Here we are 2 years hence. Where are we? What's been accomplished in terms of, where are Black Lives Matter as a transformative political movement? Minuscule in consequence relative to the transformative movement of the 1950s and 60s that brought about civil rights in the United States. Racial reckoning, I think that's a joke. I think that's a self-congratulatory posture by people who are trying to make a big deal out of it. So that's the heterodoxy that I'm talking about here. I could go into what really threatens Black life in American cities, but that would take us off script.
I'm not sure it would, but let me put this to you. I found myself re-listening this afternoon to a very moving talk, a speech you gave in the year of our Lord 2003 or something, 20 years ago, where you talk very sort of with great fervor about this scandal of mass incarceration of Black men, and where you sort of call out the American public at large as not perceiving this as a problem because this is not us. The American us, in a way, is able to ignore a glaring social scandal because it is perceived as being somehow natural, and it's not something that concerns us or our parents or our children, because the us is narrowly defined. Is not to some degree what has happened in these last 20 years, and particularly in these last 2 years, actually exactly what you were calling for 20 years ago?
I don't know. I guess we'll see. Donald Trump and the Trumpism remains to be reckoned with. The reaction, Blue Lives Matter, murder rates rise in American cities, the justice district attorneys who want to do away with cash bail and who want to not bring cases against petty criminals are being recalled by the voters. It's a delicate situation. But yes, I was at that stage in my career 20 years ago vociferously denouncing what I took to be the monumental injustice of the institutionalization of confinement of people as a response to the problem of maintaining public order, which had a widely disparate racial footprint, and which I thought was not fully being seen for what it was, in part because the people on the butt end of it were not us. I agree, and I have continued to argue, even in my heterodoxy, that we should become a country in which the significance of a life and the power of an experience would not be diminished in virtue of the fact that it issued from a person of color. That is what I continue to believe. But I think we are, with this racial victimization narrative, avoiding the hard work. We, African Americans, I speak now from within. I speak from within the community. I think we're avoiding the hard work of actually grappling with the structures among ourselves, the families that are dysfunctional, the violence, the failure to develop our full human potential, the agency that we might yet, but have not yet, exercised, that accounts for this condition. This is not a characterization of Black America writ large. These are communities of poverty and disadvantage and marginalization that have got special problems, and some of those problems have to do with the behaviors, the chosen behaviors of the people who live within those communities. And so I want to change, this is my project, I want to change the emphasis. I want to put the ball in our court. I want to stop talking about how we African Americans are victims of an oppressive system and recognize that others who are not white are making use of that system to better their lives and to advance the circumstances of their children. We can do that too. And we're deflected from doing that by the easy posture of seeing ourselves as victims and playing to the pity and condescension of white liberals who are prepared to go through the motions of saying this or that, but are not really prepared to change anything.
Thomas, would you like, I mean, the heterodoxy question is sort of still on my mind. I mean, thank you for this very clear and nuanced answer, Glenn Loury, but I do still want to know what it is that is sort of, that to your mind is wrong about certain types. I mean, you've mentioned a few things in Europe already, but broadly speaking, isn't this racial reckoning exactly what we needed at this moment? And isn't it sort of a huge opportunity to finally sort of come to terms with a problem that has been lagging for far too long in the United States?
I'm not so sure. I think what Glenn is saying, which is how we first started talking, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, is he's saying at what point do peoples who have been oppressed start to contribute to their own ongoing oppression through certain types of, I guess, value systems and cultures. And that was a lot of what my first book was about, was trying to reflect on why my comparatively privileged friends and myself were engaged in behaviors and had value systems that were so out of line with the value systems of my black father, who's old enough to be my grandfather, who grew up in the segregated South and didn't have civil rights. So why were our values so out of whack? Why were we doing self-sabotaging behaviors that, you know, he never would have dreamed of indulging in because he didn't have that kind of luxury? And so I'm sympathetic to a lot of Glenn's criticisms here. And to your question about, isn't this racial reckoning what we've been waiting for? I'm not so sure about that either, because I think that the way that the discourse is being produced now, first of all, there's a kind of elite that is, I don't really understand what it has to do with George Floyd's death that, you know, that now like certain elite corporations will say that there has to be an exact correlation between the amount of board members and their racial representation in the population at large, or why it means that like the very well-endowed Poetry Foundation has to give its endowment to black activists who graduated from Harvard in the name of racial justice. That has nothing to do with a poor man's life. I'm reading the biography of George Floyd right now. It's heartbreaking, and a lot of it has to do with, you know, an original injury that comes out of slavery. His great-grandfather certainly suffered, and none of his people were educated. But I don't see why his death, that had quite a lot to do with a fact of life in America that's very tragic and it cuts across color, drug addiction, why that means that a kind of small elite group of blacks and many other non-whites now get a kind of affirmative action that I don't think is necessarily necessary in 2022 or in 2020. You know, a lot of the situations that are being solved are not being solved for the people who are still comprising an underclass in American society. And I think what Glenn is also saying is that lost in the kind of racecraft where police brutality becomes an issue of the black-white binary is the fact that like a couple years before George Floyd died, a man named Tony Timpa, who was white, died in exactly the same way. It was videotaped. The police were laughing while he was suffocating to death in exactly the same posture. And you know, that happens in America at rates, it happens at rates that would astonish Europeans. I mean, several thousand people a year die in police custody, and about half of them, say 1,000 people die a year, to be conservative, and half of them will be white, 250 of them will be black, and most disproportionately it will be Native Americans. But we only talk about a few that play into a kind of racial narrative that we seem trapped in, but it doesn't actually get to the root causes of what a lot of these problems are. And some of them, if you want to get to the solutions, if you really care about progress, you're going to have to take seriously what Glenn is saying, that you cannot, if whites are your oppressors, you cannot hinge your liberation on appealing to their goodwill. You're going to have to liberate yourself. I think Glenn says no one's coming to save you, and that's a lesson that I think it's impossible to ignore in a multi-ethnic society like America, where you have so many children of Chinese dishwashers in Queens who are going to Harvard against all odds. At some point, you have to liberate yourself, and it might not even be fair.
Goodwill might not work. Guilt is a proposition that is being tried out right now.
I think Glenn is right. If white supremacy is all-encompassing, and even Robin DiAngelo would argue that white liberals are inherently white supremacist, then how can you depend on them to fix the situation?
I mean, you're getting to very deep philosophical problems of sort of agency in structures. Absolutely. And sort of what you emphasize, which part you emphasize. But I mean, to the police violence, just to belabor this point one more time, I mean, if we accept that the problem in America, apart from racism, whatever that is, whatever we sort of define or however we see that, is a high level of police violence towards poor people who are disproportionately black, but basically police violence. And isn't there, to some degree, could you not bring that back to the sort of original sin of American society, it being a segregated society with this constant anxiety, this constant need for violence towards parts of its population? And in that way, wouldn't you have to take the history into account if you want to change sort of the whole picture? I mean, I don't know what you would say to that, Professor Loury.
I would say that the first place I'd look for an account for the problematic conduct of some police in some places in America is the level of violent crime that they're confronting. I don't want to oversimplify. They're not simply reacting to the crime, and yes, there is a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, of the slave patrols and abusive policing, keeping blacks on the, quote, reservation, close quote. But in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Detroit, I'm not even west of the Mississippi River, carnage is unfolding before our very eyes. Over 10,000 African Americans are victims of homicide in the country in a year. Half of the homicides in America have black victims, almost all of them black perpetrators. I have friends who, when they rent a car at the airport at O'Hare in Chicago, rent down, they get as beat up a car as they can because they're going to the South Side. They know that if they stop at a filling station at 11 p.m. to fill their tank and they're driving a BMW, there is not a small chance that someone will come with a pistol and take their car from them by force. That's the reality that I said would take us off script, because it's not racism. It's not in any simple way racism. The temptation to fold it into an easy, lazy historical narrative. Well, we had slavery, well, we have Jim Crow, now we have this, should be resisted. Where is the talk about fathers who did not raise their sons with the discipline that allowed the sons to have the self-restraint, that they didn't succumb to the temptation to pick up a pistol and rob somebody for the fun of it? Where's the talk about that? It takes us off script, doesn't it? The victims, the villains somehow don't have black hats. Suddenly it's complicated. Suddenly the issues of responsibility become nuanced, murky, and uncertain and ambiguous.
Yes, That is unfortunately the case. Maybe we need to, as you say, not maybe get back on script, but sort of bring in again possibly more the question of identity, which I think was a question that... No,
Sorry.
I'm very much here for this, and I think these are very important points. But Joyce, you had a very important point, which I thought, because we're not just talking about racism, we're also talking about identity. And this black nod that you mentioned, the sort of the feeling of this tiny acknowledgement that one sort of knows. I mean, there are other groups who know this sort of phenomena, but it is sort of one acknowledges something that is relatable, but that works if you are a black minority in Europe or in the US. It doesn't work in Kenya, you said, and what you started talking about tribal identity politics in Kenya. I found that completely fascinating, because the lines there are obviously different, but they are just as constricting in their sort of in their push to confine people to single identities. And is that possibly? I mean, there is something about it. It's nice to recognize somebody who's sort of similar to you, but there's also something extremely constricting about a single identity, right? And how does that play out in the Kenyan sort of political landscape?
Ooh, yeah, indeed. Well, first of all, I don't think there's anybody who has a single identity. I always think of identities in plural. I really struggle with the idea that you're one thing and one thing only, and also that you're that one thing yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I really struggle with that, because identity is also very much shaped by circumstance, right? But the thing I was going to say is, I mean, indeed, the biggest problem we have with this whole notion of a static ethnic identity, and I'll use ethnic instead of tribe. The problem we have with this notion of a static ethnic identity, I think it was Professor Atieno Odhiambo who wrote about this, the instrumentalization of ethnicity. The fact that it is called into use and turned into a vehicle for a particular goal. So, for example, you have a candidate running for president. What's the easiest way to gather the numbers is to ascribe to a particular ethnic identity and then rally kingpins from different ethnic communities to bring out the vote. Well, that has historically worked, but what we saw in the election that we just had last month, actually, August, is that it's not as easy anymore to mobilize ethnicity for political ends, or it's a little more complicated, because you have generations now that it's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't know how to think in that unitary form. It's never been their experience. And so really, to tell them that they are something because their surname suggests it, you can no longer marshal that kind of thing for a bunch of people. But I think what's also happening is, because we now have kind of very vibrant conversations, and sometimes what I do in my work, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit, is, if I could talk about method just a little bit. If you look at Kenya at 50, what I did with that book in trying to talk about, 50 years on, what are the trends, what are the identities, what's the politics of belonging, was also just to look at the spaces, to look at the places where we don't usually look. So if you look at the sources for my arguments, it's popular music, it's fiction, it's court cases, it's obituaries. Incidentally, I'm spending a year in Berlin writing about death and funerary practice, because again, this is one of the places, because obituaries are fascinating places in terms of how a politics of identity plays out. Who is acknowledged, how are they acknowledged, what are the relationships, and all sorts of things. But the point is that when it came to method, then I was interested in looking where we don't usually look for the evidence of who people think they are, and who they then project in society. And I think that one of the biggest problems we have in a society like ours is that, self-identifying is not considered acceptable. Somebody will look at my name and decide what I am. And I just wish they would ask me. And then even when they ask me, they're expecting a particular answer that limits a place. They're not expecting a story, they're not expecting variance. Now, what I was going to say about these places that we need to start looking, if you look at what's happening in the connection now between kind of African identities and, say, Europe, look at the recent fiction that's come out of England, if you want to limit it that way. I'm thinking about the novel We Are All Birds of Uganda, yeah, by Hafsa Zayan. And there's also Jennifer Makumbi's collection of stories, Manchester Happened. What you're beginning to see is a lot of Africans who, whatever that path was, whatever it is that brought them to Europe, it's now time to talk about those identities. What does it mean to be an African in Europe? What does it mean, to think about even the trajectories of how you got there? And so what's beginning to happen is that you have a category of fiction that is allowing us now on the continent to really talk about the fluidity of our identity, because the evidence is now available from sources that usually don't make us too uncomfortable, so we can reckon with those. They're easier. Yeah.
Yeah, the fluidity of identity is, of course, something that you have thought about a lot, and this point you made about self-identifying not being acceptable, they look at your name. I mean, your point would be they look at your complexion and identify you as something, and that, in a way, especially your second book, The Self-Portrait in Black and White, it's basically an existentialist move. You want to get out of being sort of ascribed to a group. You want to sort of self-define who you are. You even go as far to say as you're going to get out of the race game. To what extent is that possible? I know it's sort of a theoretical proposition.
Yeah, I really like what you said. People don't want to let you people demand to be able to identify you. And it's something that I've really grown to rebel against, even if it's a symbolic rebellion or something. But there's some dignity in simply refusing other people's terms. Yeah, there really is. I mean, like, I think Camus, it can go in that direction of existentialism, that, like, the struggle is everything. The meaning is in the struggle. Like, I can still walk down the street in France, especially if I shave my head like I used to, and I can be controlled, as they say, for looking like an Arab. But I'm not an Arab, and I have nothing against Arabs, but I'm not an Arab. And so what the society sees me as, I can't allow it to define me, because if I walked around in a context where my physical features, my complexion, mean what they mean in France, it means I'm oftentimes looking like a Tunisian or something, and it's not me. But also, if I walk around in America, and that's the deeper lesson I learned when I had my children. If I walk around in America and I let American society define me as black, it's also a fiction. And if I let French society define my blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very pale-skinned children as white, that's a fiction. They're 25%, we did the test, they're 25% West African descended. So that's a fiction for them to be defined as white by their society. And once that started to happen, I mean, I grew up in the very American way, the absurd way of having a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mother, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, a so-called black father who had enough European DNA in him that I'm not 50% African descended, but that's slavery. And very simply, I could just walk out in the 80s and 90s in my American neighborhood, and I was black to the black kids, and I was black to the white kids. And that was the end of the story. And it wasn't even possible to select more than one box on the census until the year 2000. So there was no room for the kind of complexity of my reality in the official way that we talked about or made race. But it was when I had my kids that the fiction of the racial construct really slapped me in the face, and I couldn't recover from that. I couldn't understand how these categories could contain my family, but then I began to suspect that they don't really work, they can't really contain any of us. We all have much more going on, like you were saying. Certainly ethnically, certainly culturally, certainly on the individual level, but also many of us have much more going on biologically than the boxes we check allow for.
Yeah, I mean, the point is fascinating because it's sort of, there is also, of course, obviously a specifically American construction of race, which is basically
Binary.
a binary which goes, as you show, back to sort of plantation logic. There's the one-drop rule, and that is sort of still the case in the US today, is somewhat astonishing in a way. I mean, there are other solutions to this.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I mean, the first cracks in my understanding of myself started to happen when I moved to Paris about 11 years ago. And when people just say, "Where are you from?" in French, they say, "Where are you from?" And you say, "Well, I'm from New Jersey." And they say, "No, but where are you from?" And they mean your origins. And you say, "Well, my dad's black and my mom's white." "But where is your dad from?" "He's from Texas." "But where is he from?" And it's like, we don't know because you don't really know with the slave trade where your dad's from, if he's coming from Africa, until the kind of DNA tests happened. But as I was trying to explain the logic of the one-drop rule to people who didn't grow up in a society that had slavery within its borders, the French had slavery, but it was overseas. So within their borders, there wasn't the policing of whiteness the way that it happened in America, because blackness meant unfreedom and whiteness meant freedom. And so it was very serious if you had a drop of black blood, but in France it wasn't. So you could have Alexandre Dumas or someone like that, and everybody knows he's mixed, but it doesn't really affect. In America, that couldn't happen. So we still have the residue of having had slavery within our borders. But when I was explaining my identity to people who simply didn't start with my same presuppositions, the absurdity of the way we make race in America started to hit me in the face, because I was trying to make the American case to people who were like, but why? and then you hear yourself over and over again doing it, and it becomes less convincing even to you.
We have
That sounds ominous.
I would have one follow-up question to Glenn Loury, but I am aware of the time, and I don't know how many questions in the audience. Are there questions in the audience that maybe we should give some space to? We have a roving microphone if somebody would like to say something. I think here in the front there is somebody.
Wow.
With the music.
So I wanted to say thank you for amazing discussion, very interesting. I was really interested when Dr. Loury brought up something which I've thought for a long time about police brutality in the States, which is it's a problem which cuts across race. And I remember, I live here, but I go back a lot, and I remember hearing a story on NPR, National Public Radio, a couple years ago about a Latino kid who was killed by the police. And it wasn't the focus of the story, but black activists weren't interested in joining the protest because it was a Latino problem, and the NPR piece was mostly about lamenting the fact that there wasn't that sort of solidarity. And so I often wish that we could look at things from a human perspective and say, we have a problem, the police kill too many people. Could we get together and fight this? Each community may have its own spin. So I guess my question is, to get off my soapbox, to what degree can we keep our identities but still find some universality? Because a lot of the problems we face, really we need to face universally or as humans and not as blocks. I'll avoid the word tribes, blocks. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I don't want to cut off Glenn if Glenn wants to address the question.
Well, no, I was only going to observe that if a person is genuinely on the left in terms of their political orientation, their first impulse should be to think in terms of class. And that actually is, to my mind, a much more compelling frame for trying to understand, well, in the case at hand, police mistreatment of citizens under difficult circumstances. The whites who are killed by police more numerously than the blacks in the United States are largely working and lower class, poor and marginal in their economic and social status within the society. So my answer to the question is think class, not race. Resist the temptation to frame these issues gratuitously, unnecessarily in racial terms.
So that was a very good point you raised, and so it gets to one of the sources of my uneasiness with a movement like Black Lives Matter. I think Black Lives Matter accomplished some very good things in the beginning, especially by raising the awareness in the popular imagination of how violent and brutal the police are. But I think it actually contradicts or counters its ultimate purpose, which is, the problem is that the police are killing people. A disproportionate number compared to whites are black, but they're killing a lot of American citizens, period. And they're brutalizing non-citizens. We don't even really know how badly they're brutalizing non-citizens. We have a police brutality problem. All Americans should be concerned that fellow citizens are being manhandled this way. And we should have a way of talking about it that brings us all collectively to buy into a different value system. It was part of the problem that I saw really highlighted with the response in March 2020, April 2020 to the pandemic. It was being framed, and I think it's also pragmatic. Like, you need people to implicate themselves in it, not just feel sympathy for a specific group or see the issue as being racialized. Black and Latino people were disproportionately dying from COVID-19, not because COVID-19 respects man-made categories of so-called biological race, because they had a lot of comorbidities and other underlying circumstances that made them more susceptible. Immediately, the New Yorker and all these other publications started calling it a black plague, and what happened was that white people started tuning out and actually stopped caring about COVID because it was a problem for blacks and Latinos. It should be a problem that the whole society was concerned with, and it actually worked against the purposes of even safeguarding the people you say you care about, because once some people weren't caring about it, actually blacks and Latinos were more susceptible to getting harmed by it, all in the name of saying that this was something that was racialized. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Do we have any more questions, remarks from the audience? There is here in the second row a gentleman.
Hi, good to meet you. Actually, I draw cartoons for the New Yorker.
What's that?
Actually, I draw cartoons for the New Yorker.
Oh.
So sometimes I do get caught in like, am I allowed to draw this? Because
It's a brave profession.
Yeah, but I get a lot of rejects because I think there's a lot of comedy in the racial. Yeah, and there's a lot of comedy, I think, in this discussion, and that's my participation in this discussion. But I also wonder, is there room for a kind of black identity, a culturally black identity, while at the same time throwing away the race card and kind of changing blackness to like a sort of, instead of race, a cultural kind of thing, like.
Yes, absolutely. That would be my position.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to stop participating in or feeling affinity for the traditions of certain peoples from certain places and certain times that made contributions that matter. So the people, for me, that created the blues and jazz and that led to hip hop, those people created tradition, a way of talking, a way of slapping hands that I like to participate in, but it's got nothing to do with blood and skin. And I think that we do ourselves harm when we think that it does. And I think you
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
No, just very briefly, I'm amused here because I was watching with my wife a B movie on television late one night recently. I don't remember the name of it. I'll be quick. The scene is, there's a vehicle, it's stopped by the police officer. It's late at night, and there's a bunch of white guys. They're 18, 20, 22 years old, and they've been smoking weed and drinking and carousing, and there's 6 of them in the car, and they're making a lot of noise. And the police comes over, and he says, are you guys, you black guys, and they're all white. They're all white. But with the hip-hop banging off of the radio and the reefer smoke coming out of the window, and the way they were handling themselves, the cop assumed they were black. And here's the thing, they started celebrating and high-fiving with each other the fact that the guy thought that they were black, because that was the coolest possible thing that could be thought about them in their minds. He said comedy was a helpful adjacent vehicle, so I thought I'd inject some.
I'd like to inject another one, because I think there's a rejected There's a
Please do.
rejected New Yorker cartoon that really got me. I usually don't participate in the debate as well. I kind of also just live and be a person because I'm stuck here by myself anyways. But I did this cartoon that I think is the funniest ever, and it was a Christmas cartoon with Mary, Joseph, and the three wise men. And the three wise men are from the three different tribes or whatever. And Mary's, everybody's white, Jesus is black, one of the wise men is black, and Mary's like, it's a miracle. Rejected.
They rejected that?
Yeah. I'm like, that's a classic. I just think there's room to identify, there's room in there for comedy.
There is.
Thank you for that story. That will stay with me. I think that in the service of good order, because this place will be taken over in a moment by the next panel, I will have to close it here. Unless, Joyce, of course, you have something to add to the comedy part of the evening.
Oh, no, I really don't have much to say except to say, I love those moments of bricolage where you're trying to show how something has roots in so many other things, even though we are trying to limit it to what we need, yeah? So I love moments like that. Thank you.
I think that we'll have to wrap it up. I want to thank all my three panelists for your insights and your patience, and Glenn Loury especially for sort of joining us from afar with a good connection, thank God. I want to thank the International Berlin Literature Festival for hosting this event, and of course you, the audience, for both here and online, obviously, for your interest and your attention. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Oh.